Hello, Year 10. So here we find ourselves again then, me sitting in a room talking to myself, attempting to teach you via PowerPoint. As I mentioned in my email to you, we are going to pause our study of A Christmas Carol. I know some classes are partway through it, some classes were about to start it before Christmas, but we made the decision that we were going to begin that again or start that back up when we return into school. Because what I don't want to do, as some of you had to do with the inspector calls, is do it all during the lockdown and then having to do it immediately when we return to school is slightly tedious for you probably. So we will pick A Christmas Carol back up when we are in school together. Instead, what we're going to be focusing on this term is poetry. Now, as you know, you have an anthology of 18 poems. We have studied the war and the power poems last term and in term 1. This term, we are going to be looking at the nature and the place poems. And we're going to start with Romanticism and the Romantic poets. Now, yesterday, you should have watched or rewatched, in the case of some of you, a documentary that gave you some information about the Romantic poets and what they believed in, as well as some information about William Blake and William Wordsworth, who were both early Romantic poets and are but two of the poets that we will be studying this term. Now, before we move on to that, we're just going to do, as always, a little bit of vocabulary recap. So the first word I'd like you to recall is jovial. What can you remember jovial means? And what signs do we have that Scrooge is becoming more jovial? So think about wherever you've read as a class. What signs do you have that Scrooge is becoming more jovial as the novel progresses? Our next word we're going to remember is misanthropic. And think about stave 1, think about right at the start. How is Scrooge presented as misanthropic in stave 1? If you're one of the classes that hasn't started the text yet, think back to the module of work we did at the start of last year, where you did look at Dickens and look at A Christmas Carol and see if you can remember anything about that. So you may well want to pause the video and answer those questions now. So our new word today is corrupt. Now, if someone is corrupt, they are having or showing a willingness to act dishonestly in return for money or personal gain. So if someone is corrupt, then they will do something wrong or behave in a dishonest way because it's going to gain them something. It may gain them money, may gain them status, but it is not a good thing. Now, this is a bit of a loaded question, really. What examples of corruption do you see in society today? Now, I'm sure if we were all in a classroom together, we would have great fun discussing that, but I'll leave that for you to use on yourselves at home. Maybe ask your parents what their opinion is. So pause this slide now and have a go at answering the questions. So jovial means jolly, and we see Scrooge beginning to become more jovial throughout stave 2 and stave 3. In stave 2, he becomes very jovial when he is witnessing Fezziwig's party. He is reminding himself how much he valued Fezziwig and how much he enjoyed the sociability of that apprenticeship. In stave 3, we see him becoming very jovial when he witnesses Fred's party, and he's actually unconsciously joining in, even though no one can see him. So again, these are all signs of how Scrooge is beginning to transform and change and find redemption as a result of the teachings of the ghosts. If someone is misanthropic, they are very unsociable, very nasty, very unkind. It's a very much an every man for himself attitude. In stave 1, we know that Scrooge is the absolute archetype of someone who is misanthropic. He is selfish, he is greedy, he is unkind, he is unfeeling, he is unsociable, he thinks the poor should die to decrease the surplus population, he thinks they should all go to workhouses or prisons, he is unpleasant to Bob Cratchit and resents having to give him Christmas Day off. He describes it as picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. He rejects his own nephew. he is incredibly unpleasant. We won't go through what examples of corruption we see in our society today. I will leave that for you to think about yourselves. So today we're going to summarise the context and subject matter of William Blake's London. So by the end of the lesson, you will know what beliefs William Blake had and what influenced his poetry, what society was like in the late 17th and early 18th century, and how Blake uses language to reflect this in his poem. We know that the context is very important when we're studying this anthology poetry because you will be explicitly marked on it. So, some information about William Blake then. You may want to pause this slide and bullet point some key contextual information. So he was a prolific English poet. That means prolific, very important, very influential. So a prolific English poet and artist who is considered to have made a very important contribution to the history of art and the Romantic movement, despite being largely unrecognised in his lifetime. Now, William Blake was as much an artist as he was a poet, absolutely extraordinarily beautiful artist and an engraver, as well as being a poet, but he wasn't someone who was very famous or recognised during his lifetime for his work. He produced some of the most memorable pieces of art and poetry ever created and is widely remembered as a man of extremes. And this is a very good way of classifying Blake. He is someone that had quite extreme views and beliefs. His comments about his society were often rejected by his contemporaries. These are the people that lived at the same time as him, and only valued by critics later. He was able to express social comment and philosophy through his creativity. So all of his artwork and all of his poetry is him showing his own views and opinions about the society that he lives in. And a lot of these views weren't very popular with the people at the time. Much of Blake's work reflects the influences of religion and revolution on 18th century society. Although highly religious, he was critical of the Church of England and used some of his poems to pass comment and judgment on the role of the church in society. Now, William Blake was an incredibly devoutly religious man. He absolutely believed in God and Jesus and, you know, the Holy Trinity, the Holy Spirit. However, he had, as with all of his views, quite radical views when it came to this. But he viewed God as the eternal Father. He viewed God as something wonderful and positive. And he felt that a lot of the traditional organisation of Christianity, the church, were very corrupt. He believed that the priests were not truly living by or promoting the teachings of Jesus. And he believed that they were using Christianity for their own gain and for the exploitation of the vulnerable in society. And William Blake was someone that was very much aware of the social inequalities that existed. He was someone who was incredibly pro-revolution as well. He was an anarchist and a rebel. You know, nowadays he would be the sort of person, you know, like Extinction Rebellion, gluing himself to tubes and, you know, chaining themselves to the Houses of Parliament. He was someone who very much wanted the peasants and the everyday folk of England to rise up against the monarchy, rise up against the church and the government to create a fairer and better society. So during the late 18th century, the French Revolution was taking place and a sense of uprising against authority, the monarchy and the church, was spreading. In 1792, when London was written, the poem, revolutionary mobs were invading Paris to overthrow the king. Blake openly supported this rebellion, and despite the government putting in place a law to outlaw writings of disloyal nature, Blake still manages to reveal his discontent through, you know, the sort of negative voices that he sees, you know, in London. And he was someone who was very, very pro-revolution. So what I'd like you to do is pause this video and just bullet point 3 or 4 of what you think the most important pieces of information we have just found out about William Blake. And obviously you can use your notes from yesterday when you watch the documentary to add to this as well. So, as I said, Blake wrote many poems, as well as painted many pictures and did many engravings. The poem London is from a collection, his most famous collection, probably most studied collection, called The Songs of Innocence and Experience. And this is something that was published in 2 sections. You have The Songs of Innocence is positive in tone, celebrates love, childhood and nature. However, the Songs of Experience show the negative side effects of modern life upon nature and people. It views the modern condition as dangerous and corrupt, promoting poverty, child labour and prostitution. So Innocence is very much about a celebration of childhood, celebration of all of those romantic ideals and beliefs, predominantly the worship of nature. Whereas Experience is really showing all of the negative sides of a modern society. And things like poverty, child labour and prostitution is something that he feels very, very strongly about. Essentially the Songs of Experience are a social protest. They deal with the fact that Blake was very disillusioned with religion and authority and any sort of form of control that existed at the time. So what I'd like you to do is think about modern day London. What impressions do you have of the city today, and how might you describe it? Because the poem London by Blake is essentially him doing exactly that, him taking a walk around London where he lived and describing what he sees and describing what he feels about it. So pause the video and just jot some of that down. So like I said at the start of the lesson, this lesson is contextual. This lesson is getting us to really understand the backdrop to London. And to do that, we're going to look at this image, this drawing, called Gin Lane, or Hogarth, by Hogarth, and it was drawn in 1751. Now, you may need to get quite close to the screen to do this, but I'd just like you to pause the video and really have a look at the details in this poem. Look at the different sections of it. Look at the types of people that are portrayed in it, that are drawn. Look at their appearance. Look at what they're doing. And look at what this, and begin to consider what this might suggest about society at the time Blake was writing London, at society at the end of the 18th century. So pause the video now and have a really detailed look at all of the different aspects and sections of this picture. So, some things that you probably have picked out then. We have the fact that we have a pawnbrokers here. We have this more wealthy looking gentleman in a wig and some poorer people trying to sell their things to them. Now, a pawnbroker is someone who will buy things people want to sell and sell them for profit. And obviously, the typical people that would go to pawnbrokers would be the poor. You there's a bill you need to pay, you need to sell things in order that you own in order to pay it. But obviously, a pawnbroker is someone who gets rich off off people's poverty, a little bit like Scrooge. Below that, the next arrow, we see 2 old women gnawing bones next to a dog. And again, think about, what is this revealing about society at the time? Below that, we have an arrow pointing to a woman who was nursing or breastfeeding her baby, and the baby is now fallen out of her arms and she's not looking particularly bothered about it. Again, what is this image suggesting, or this part of the image suggesting about society at the time? Opposite that, we have an arrow to the man who looks very wasted away. You can very clearly see his rib cage. What does this person suggest about society at the time? Above that, we then have a woman feeding something to her baby. Now, we don't know if this is medicine. We don't know if this is alcohol, potentially. Remember, there would have been very little safe drinking water for the poor. What might this reveal about society? The arrow above that pointing into the crowd. We see again a man being carried about in a wheelbarrow, drinking something, what looks like some sort of angry mob. And then in the middle of that, someone being put into a coffin. What might that reveal about society? And then finally, at the top, we have someone who has clearly hung themselves. What does that reveal about society? So what I would like you to do is essentially do a bit of an analysis of this picture. So we have 6 different sections. I would like you to write a sentence for each of those sections. What does it suggest about society at the end of the 18th century? So you can pause the video and get that done. So ultimately, all of your sentences will have added together to show that society was very corrupt. You have people, like the mother who's clearly drunk, unable to look after her child. We have, the city presented in an incredibly negative way. We have people essentially starving to death and dying on the streets. We have women having to chew the bones of dogs because they have nothing to eat. We have people having to sell their possessions because they have no money. We have general drunkenness and disorderly behaviour. We have death in the streets. And potentially with the man who has hung himself, we have people unable to live with how awful life is for them. So we can see here that it is a very negative social commentary about what life is like, particularly for the poor and the destitute. And again, we can see lots of similarities here, not just with A Christmas Carol, but also with an Inspector Calls. We know that Inspector Calls, which we've all studied, is a text about poverty and the fact that the rich do not help and do not support the poor enough. And we know as a socialist, this is something Priestley was incredibly against. We know that Dickens, even though he wasn't technically a socialist, we know that he felt very, very strongly due to his experiences as a child in the blackening factory and his father's debt, that anyone could fall on hard times, and being poor doesn't necessarily make you a bad person. Now, William Blake had very similar beliefs to both Dickens and Priestley. He felt very strongly that there was no one there to help the poor. It's why he was so angry at the church. You think about the teachings of Jesus, you couldn't find a more gentle, mild-mannered person who desperately cared for the plight of the poor and the vulnerable. He believed that priests should live their lives based on those teachings of Jesus, and the fact that they didn't is something that Blake really struggled as a Christian to deal with, which is why he tended to be very negative about the organised church. So we're going to read through London. We're not going to analyse it line by line and annotate it. We're going to do that in tomorrow's lesson. We're just today thinking about our first impressions, how those first impressions link to the image that we've just analysed, and how those first impressions reflect the beliefs of Blake. So here's the poem. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So we can see here that this is a very observational poem, but it is one that is presenting an incredibly negative opinion of what he's seeing around him in London. Now, there will be some unfamiliar language here. What I would like you to do is I would like you to try and match the vocabulary here to the definition. So we have woe, chartered, forged, manacles, hapless, ban, harlot, blights, and hurts. Okay, so again, pause the video and try and see if you can match these up. So, given over to the use of business, rented or licensed, would be a ban. Sorry, chartered, reading that wrong. So chartered would be given over to the use of business, rented or licensed. Woe would be worry or anxiety. Forged, something that is shaped by heating or hammering, or could be a fraudulent imitation. So if you forge money, for example, in this context, he's likely talking about forging something, as in a blacksmith creating it. Manacles would be handcuffs. A ban, a public announcement. Hapless means hopeless or helpless. Harlot is another word for a prostitute. Blights could be a plant disease caused by insects, or an ugly urban area, or something, you know, that is spoilt. And a hearse is a vehicle which conveys a coffin. So there's just some of the vocabulary that may be unfamiliar. You might want to make sure you've got those definitions correct, or even write some of them down. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to write a brief summary of how Blake's impression of London compares to Hogarth's in this image. What impression does this image give you of London, and how does that link to William Blake's? Are they creating a similar or a different impression of London? And focus on the particular people that he mentions in London and the different types of people who are mentioned or shown in this image, and think about those connections. So you can pause the video and just complete that task. So finally then, you can think about the final question here, just to consolidate the learning that you've done. How does Blake present society as corrupt in his poem? So how is society shown as being corrupt? So think about this idea of corrupt being someone who's dishonest, someone who's just out for their personal gain. How does Blake reflect that in London? And tomorrow we will annotate the poem in detail. Okay, thank you for listening. I should maybe do a classic YouTube shim. Should I tell you to like and subscribe, which always cracks me up? Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling nonsense at you now. Nice to virtually speak to you, and we'll do another lesson tomorrow. Farewell.